This human journey is fragile, is vulnerable. We have good days, bad days. Sometimes I'll say in leadership work, you go, I could be a great leader on Monday morning, an average leader on Monday afternoon, and a terrible leader on Tuesday morning. It's not a given. It's a messy process.
Welcome to The Secret Life of Great Leaders, a podcast by Triple Goal. We share deep transformational conversations around leadership and personal development to help you uncover the unseen facets of human growth and leadership impact. I'm your host, Michael Bunting. Hello, and welcome to the very first episode of The Secret Life of Great Leaders. I'm Michael Bunting, and I'm grateful to have you here. This podcast is about transformation and understanding the process, the deep inner processes that help people become their best, teams become their best, even nations become their best. I'll be interviewing a host of leaders who've done the hard work alongside transformational experts from all around the world, and will help you understand how you can grow as a human being, how you can lead more effectively, and how you can get more out of life than you're currently getting. I'll start off with a little bit about myself so you understand where this work comes from. So a little bit about me. I've been involved in leadership and leadership growth work nearly my entire adult life, even when I had my first job after university, which was in the foreign trading area. I was already doing night classes in Eastern and Western philosophy, trying to answer these questions of like, what is my mind? How does this human existence work? Is there more to this existence than the surface level? And ultimately, that led me into advanced adult development study and work. And then that became integrated into classic leadership work. So now I've written several books on the subject. I've happened to be lucky enough to work with some of the largest organizations and executive teams around the world on helping them answer the question of how do we become better from a behavioral perspective, and therefore how do we help our people become happier or more engaged at work? How do we become more innovative? And how do we actually drive performance? That's at the corporate level. At the personal level, for me, it's all about freedom and happiness. Like, how do we get out of our own way? Sean Acor's research tells us that 90% of our happiness is determined by how we think, how we process the world, only 10% by what's going on outside the world. Sean Acor from Harvard. And so it's interesting because we have so little skill. I've seen this having worked in this field for nearly 3 decades. We have so little skill in understanding how to manage that internal world for better external outcomes. And that's been an absolute lifelong love affair and obsession. And you'll see in this podcast, you'll get that revealed to you of how it actually works internally. I have a very cynical mind, and I don't just believe things. I need to investigate things like a scientist. And hopefully you'll see when you watch the episodes that I'll keep bringing that evidence-based scientific approach to the field of deep personal development work to be practical. It has to have practical outcomes, right? It has to make your life better. And so you'll see that as we move through the episodes, you'll learn the processes to do that. So why this work matters is that we've seen that leaders make an incredible impact on the people they lead. In fact, a third of people's mental health can be explained by their boss's behavior. More than 40% of their engagement and 50% of the performance of organizations is attributed to behavior. But there's very little understood about behavior, and particularly how to grow and to change behavior. Unfortunately, in many organizations, including in our private lives, we think events can change our behavior or change our lives. I'll go to that one weekend workshop. I'll do that 1-hour webinar. And we've learned over time that transformational work, the stuff that really matters and the stuff that really makes a difference, is not as simple as events, but it still is relatively simple. And there are really amazing ways to unlock our potential if we just have a little bit of maturity to go a little bit deeper and to actually sustain practice. So whilst I've studied with some extraordinary teachers and worked with some extraordinary people, my first book was written with Kouzes and Posner, who have the world's most researched leadership model. It's all steeped in this theory. It's been anything but a nice distant theoretical experience for me in my own life. I started really fascinated with who am I, why am I here, and what's this human existence. at the age of 22. In fact, my first work experience was like an existential crisis. I remember walking in and go, okay, this is the adult world. I'd finished my honors degree in business administration, and I was expecting something magical from the adult world. And what I found was that people were just sort of working, and they were complaining, and there was gossiping. And the main conversation was, what's up for your weekend, and where did you go on holiday, or where are you going on holiday? And I was very disheartened by how shallow everything was. And so that pushed me into going, I cannot believe that this is what life's only got to offer. There must be more depth, hidden teaching, something. And that led me down the path of understanding and studying Eastern and Western philosophy, depth psychology. I studied with multiple psychologists around the world. I ended up doing psychotherapy training myself and a postgrad in psychotherapy. I think the biggest realization I've had is beautifully summed up with Alison Agnostakis's work on adult development, that it's the way we work with our emotional world that matters far more than the intellectual world. And let me give you an example. Or what happened for me was I'd been, meditating an hour a day. I never liked meditating, but I loved the logic of it. You need to clear the mind and precisely see what's going on. Otherwise, you can't ever understand the mind. I got that. I didn't like it, but I did it. 10 years of 1 hour a day discipline, mindfulness practice. But I still came to like a dead end wall. I didn't feel particularly happier. I didn't feel any more enlightened. And then my own life fell apart at that point, funny enough, despite the fact that I was already teaching awareness work and standing on stages. And, my life looked great. I was this young, wise, apparently, man. But then a divorce happened and my life completely fell apart. And in all of that aftermath of the mess, I was lucky enough to meet Russ Hudson and Don Risa of the Enneagram. And I'm just cutting a long story short here. Russ, I was trying to work on my own growth and trying to learn from my experience. And Russ asked me to do a very simple exercise. He said, can you draw pictures? And I said, yeah, I had some degree of skill. He said, I want you to spend the entire day drawing one beautiful picture. Were you really happy with it? Good. And then once you've done that, I want you to either burn the paper or fold it away and crumple it up. I remember saying to Russ, what's the point of that? That makes absolutely no sense. And so he said, well, if you could do something with it, what would you do? And I said, well, I would show people, look what I've done for the day. So he said, oh, right. So your obsession with excellence, which had been true of my whole life. I'd wanted to be a professional golfer. Everything I'd done, I would practice till my hands would bleed. Everything was all about winning. He said to me, so it's not really about the excellence, is it? It's about being seen to be excellent. You want to show the picture. So what you're really after is love. Attention, not excellence. That's secondary. Excellence is a means to love and attention, approval. And we now we have this quite complex assessment we run on leaders called the Leadership Growth Profile. And one of the things we measure is how subject to approval are you as a human being unconsciously. Up until that moment, I had no idea that my life was defined by approval, and that I thought it was about being excellence, but just beneath that, it was this deep insecurity, an imposter syndrome, and not enoughness that was running this intense amount of suffering in me. And then I remember asking Russ, well, how do you get out of that? How do you get out of this approval pattern, which comes from really deep inside? How do you become free of it? And he said, oh, that's really easy. You just completely be vulnerable and totally honest all the time. And I remember the shock and horror of that idea, because I had this other belief system inside myself, which was, if I'm really open and honest, I'm really just myself without trying to impress or talk about my achievements, then nobody wants that. Nobody loves that. And then he helped me see. So really at the core, you don't believe you have any intrinsic worth, right? Which it took me several months to process that, because I got the logic of it. Everything makes logical sense, but it was hard to accept that underneath all the show and the achievements was this empty nothingness. And so I began the practice of sharing honestly and being vulnerable with no masks or image management. And it was incredibly, incredibly difficult process. But over time, I began to see that the most important people in my life stuck around. and I became more relaxed in myself. And ironically, the less I was trying to prove myself, I often say, like, the more you try and be impressive, the less impressive you are. But then if you try and be less impressive to be impressive, because you're still approval addicted, that doesn't work either. You get into a real mess. So I began to become more what you call inwardly centered. It's like, how am I going to live this day from a perspective of integrity, and eventually turn into kindness as well, where it's independent of approval. And that process of moving into speaking the truth about myself and my I don't knows and my vulnerabilities, and also holding people to account on what I saw was happening, because I wasn't feeling so dependent on their approval, was more concerned with how am I showing up, it's nothing short of life altering in the deepest possible way. It's like taking off a prison sentence and learning a degree of freedom. And then all the fears about, oh my God, if I'm really, really honest, you know, my life will turn into a train wreck and I will be disapproved of. It Quite the opposite happened over the arc of time. And so in my professional work, I meet leader after leader after leader who is stricken by this underlying need for approval, and even believes that the secret to their success is this desperate need for approval, whether it's pleasing the boss or pleasing the direct reports. But our research has shown us that the more you're beholden to approval, it actually reduces your effectiveness. Equally, things like control or security, I've learned over time that the more we can see what's unconsciously driving us, yes, it's confronting, but enables the possibility of stepping free of patterns that actually don't work. And we've been fortunate enough to research it. They just don't work. Now, my own growth process is by far not over. And that's the beauty of growth, is that you can keep growing. Like, it just never ends. It was only 2 or 3 months ago, at the time of doing this podcast, that I had an insight that I make myself responsible for the emotions of those people around me in a very subtle way. And and then I can often turn into quite a needy, oh, you okay person, even though I've got this tough part of myself too. And just seeing another layer of sort of trap, if you will, it was another moment of freedom. Every time we see a pattern that's got us caught, we are able to make choices that they always make more intellectual sense. So over the years of this work, I've become really, really, what's the right word? Obsessed, or not obsessed is not right, but loving the fact that I'm in a field that I can help people see patterns of behavior and thoughts in themselves that are really, really keeping them stuck. And once they move out of it, it's like this whole new life occurs, as it has for me. I still work with my challenges. I often say, if you ever meet an awareness teacher or a psychologist who says, "No, I'm perfect and I've got all my stuff together, run a mile," they're fake. They're lying, because this human journey is fragile, is vulnerable. We have bad days, good days. Sometimes I'll say in leadership work, I could be a great leader on Monday morning, an average leader on Monday afternoon, and a terrible leader on Tuesday morning. It's not a given. Same as parenting, same as husbanding, for myself, or wifing, or whatever you're partnering. It's a messy process, but understanding the mechanics of what's going on underneath can be absolutely and is life changing. And that's what this podcast is, and the themes of the show is all around this. Every single person I've ever met has their own fears that they're trying to deal with. Organizations have their own struggles that they're dealing with, and everyone wants some kind of improvement. They want to make their world better. Unfortunately, a lot of the events and offerings don't actually make anything better. They add more noise. They're throwing techniques at problems. There's a lot of noise and activity around making better, but not much is understood about the true process of growth and transformation. And that's what this podcast is all about. It's about helping you understand how to go a little bit beyond the surface into what really matters, and then getting more out of yourself and your life, your leadership, your organization that you ever dreamed possible. My own insight with this work in my own life was, at the age of 22, I started dedicated meditation because I was determined to become enlightened and understand myself and understand the world. And for 10 years, I never failed to meditate once every day. I did an hour of meditation every single day. But I came to a kind of block or a wall eventually, because I realized life taught me that unless you actually deal with your emotional world constructively, it doesn't matter how much white knuckling you do, even meditation practice, which I had a strong love-hate relationship with. You can't outrun yourself. And most importantly, you can't outrun your own mind and your emotional world. And my world crashed in a divorce when I realized that I was far more fragile than my arrogant mind would have me believe. And I ended up going through a very deep journey around what we call shadow work, or understanding the wounded parts of myself. And it was super uncomfortable, but it taught me a profound level of compassion for myself and others. My nickname used to be Confronting Bunting when I first started teaching, actually, in the corporate space. But that was a kind of hardened self, a kind of, you should do this, a preaching self. And that breakdown of my life, I ended up losing my children to another country. They came back to me eventually, but it was like a stripping of all the ego's pretense around being enlightened and being smart and being intelligent. And that grounding down process helped me soften tremendously and create more safety for myself and for others to explore more tender topics that we're all fascinated with, but very rarely have enough compassion or curiosity to touch. And that then transformed the way I present, teach, and coach people. And I'm much more able to provide space now for people to share their difficulties. And that's really been an interesting piece, because in my last book I wrote, Vertical Growth, we had 25 leaders from all around the world sharing their vulnerable stories. And I remember our publisher said to us, I cannot believe people are willing to put their names to this. And I remember having a moment of deep gratitude for that, my life breaking down several years before, because it had taught me to go deeper and to actually acknowledge and look at the emotional world. I think a lot of high achievers, and I was certainly one of those when I was younger, or at least attempting to be a high achiever, we tend to think we can park our emotions and just race to the finish line. But if we ask ourselves, what are we racing to? We often are blank. In fact, I've asked many of my clients, so what's at the end of that finish line that you're racing to, that you're self-abusing for, that you're running towards? And also, what are you running away from? And there's usually a blank. And so we end up in these lives like I was, kind of racing towards, in my case, it was enlightenment and a successful business, without really knowing what that means, because it's an idealization and we lose our humanity. I certainly lost my humanity, and was, in some way, my life falling apart was a necessary part of my own growth. So what's been fascinating about that too is the research on how adults grow, how we actually transform as human beings. The key finding is that it's all about your relationship with your mind, your body, and feelings. If we can't handle discomfort, we tend to go into these compensating patterns, which ironically, even for someone like me who was trying to go deeper, had these unconscious blocks. And this is for senior leaders. When senior leaders can't cope with their own emotional world constructively, they make really bad decisions. I've worked with CEOs on not holding their team to account because it's too emotionally uncomfortable. I've worked with leaders who are not willing to cut parts of their business out that are not working anymore, downsize. Even actually work with leaders who struggle to appreciate and praise people. Why? Because it's emotionally uncomfortable. And I think we completely discount how significant our own emotional world is in our mind is towards our so-called practical decisions. And that's been the most beautiful learning for me and the most important learning for me. What this podcast is about, it's about interviewing leaders who've actually done the transformational work. And so to get insights out of them, to hear their inspiring stories, so that you can connect with those stories and make sense of them in terms of your own life, and perhaps take similar journeys on, or at least if you feel alone in certain insecurities and patterns, you'll hear some of the most successful leaders in the world have similar insecurities, and at least you can connect with it, understand that this whole imposter syndrome that nearly every single leader I've ever worked with has some kind of is afflicted by. And it's also about getting technical understanding. So we're going to interview experts who really understand how to explain how does growth work? What are the key steps to growth? What is growth all about? Actually, it's about reducing your own levels of suffering, your own levels of difficulty, and increasing your own happiness. But alongside that, to reach your full potential, how do you live a life that one day you'll look back on and you go, I'm so proud of what I did, the courage it took to grow. I outgrew some family patterns that were limiting. I outgrew limiting beliefs. And I really am deeply, deeply satisfied and proud of this life. That's what this podcast is about, the secret life of great leaders, but revealing that secret life to you, the viewer, the listener, so that you can actually really make a difference to your own life. So who's this podcast for? It's for curious people who want to understand themselves, who want to understand the process of growth, who want to reach their full potential. It's obviously relevant to HR leaders, CEOs, executive teams, even right down to junior leaders of organizations or even aspiring leaders who want to understand the deeper process of growing into your full potential. But we'll also be talking a little bit about organizational challenges. So it'll be very relevant to you if you are currently a leader or a coach or an HR leader, and you want to understand how the process of change works so that you can implement change and growth inside yourself, inside your team, and inside your organization, or even for that matter, inside your family. It's very common for our clients to say, I might have been in a leadership course in a corporate context, but this work's actually changed my marriage, it's changed my parenting. You'll see that we talk about topics that are universally applicable to work and to home, to yourself and to others. So what are we exploring in this podcast? The first and most obvious thing is, how do you grow as a human being? If you know what great leadership looks like, how come, you maybe not be there yet? Or maybe you thought you were there and then you got some feedback that, you weren't there. So how do you move from where you are to where your greatest potential lies? So that's a very strong field. It's a process of growth. Over the years, we've become less interested in leadership models and more interested in the process of growth, because that's where the magic actually happens. We'll also look at how groups change or organizations change, because it turns out that there's also collective behaviors, what we sometimes call red zone behavior in our work, where there's a collective of non-ideal behaviors in an entire group of people, and they're all in collective denial of it. How do you bring that out, and how do you change entire groups? It's true even of nations. Like, even nations have particular habits of behavior that they are so ingrained that they don't even know they're doing it, but they also don't see that it's not helpful. So our work's culture transformation. So we'll also be looking at the subject of how do we change group behavior into wiser choices. Thank you for joining this first episode. My intention for this podcast, The Secret Life of Great Leaders, is to uncover what's going on beneath the surface and to make it logical and accessible. Everything's so logical beneath the surface. And the more you get into this podcast, the more you'll see that you can bring your intelligence and your cognitive brain to the subject of emotions and transformation and growth. The whole point is to help people grow to their full potential, which ultimately makes the world a kinder, more ethical, and even in a business sense, more profitable place. The Secret Life of Great Leaders is brought to you by Triple Goal, where good coaches become great and leaders grow their impact where it matters most. Discover more at triplegoal.com. Make sure to search for The Secret Life of Great Leaders in Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, or anywhere else podcasts are found. Click subscribe so you don't miss any future episodes. On behalf of the team here at Triple Goal, thanks for listening.